Join us now on Flickr at flickr.com/groups/art-of-photography. Welcome to the Art of Photography. I'm Ted Forbes again, and today we're going to talk about metering with your camera. Okay. Now, last time we talked about metering with a handheld light meter, and we'll go into more podcasts. I think this is the wonderful thing that I can do with this podcast is kind of build on previous material. So don't worry if you still have some questions on something. Feel free to come on Flickr and ask, or just kind of hang out because we're going to cover things kind of over and over in more detail in some of these podcasts. But today we're going to talk about how to meter using your camera. Okay. Now, in this first example, I've intentionally picked an old camera because the evolution of camera metering has come quite a ways in the last 20 years, 30 years or so. This particular model is a Nikon F3. It's a wonderful film camera, very simple, very easy to use, and this was the Nikon camera that all the pros used for years. These were designed in the early 80s. This was really kind of a, in terms of popularity, a very benchmark camera for for Nikon. Whoa. Nikon would not appreciate me blundering there, but anyway, and it's very easy how to use this camera. On these older lenses, and this has been removed on a lot of the newer digital cameras because in the digital stuff, most everything is self-contained inside the camera, and you simply use the shutter wheel and things like that to change your settings. But on these older cameras, there's a lot more manual stuff going on. And up here on the top, I'll show you, you have the aperture ring around the lens, and you can see that it has a series of stops that are marked off on this aperture ring. Okay, so 2.5 is wide open on this particular lens, and as I back this off, I got 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22. So it goes up in increments of one stop. Now I can actually kind of put this halfway between the two, and you can get half stops. That's certainly achievable. The camera will work doing that. So if you half a stop of light, I don't know, either in the darkroom or in Photoshop, that's pretty easily to manipulate without losing too much data, so I don't worry too much about half stops ever. Anyway, and then on the top of the camera over here, you also have the, this wheel will adjust the shutter speed, okay? So you have, remember this doubles with your light, so you have roughly, so you have 8, 15, 30, 60, 125, 250, 500, etc. These are faster shutter speeds. I have this set right now to the letter A, which means automatic, okay? Now, this camera featured what was known as Aperture Priority metering, okay, which basically means what I'm going to do is if I set that to automatic, that means it's going to meter through the lens, and whatever aperture I have this set at, it's going to do the calculations to come up with the correct shutter speed. Okay, and when you actually look through the lens, it tells you, it gives you a preview when you half hold down the button. It tells you what shutter speed it's going to give you, so you know if it's too slow to hand hold, or if you need a tripod, something like that. Or if it's too slow and I don't care too much about my depth of field, I can simply open the diaphragm and increase my aperture size. But anyway, that's basically how it is. It's a point and shoot, but you select your aperture and it figures out the shutter speed. Okay, so that was pretty early metering. This is also a technique of what's known as center weighted metering, which basically it takes the scene that you're photographing through the lens, and it has a center circle that it's kind of looking at, and it's I can't really remember the I think this is either 30-70 or 80-20. It's a percentage of what they figure your subject will probably be in the middle of the shot. So it's weighting the metering towards the middle and comes up with an average for your exposure. The F3 is a great camera, and I actually really prefer to meter this way. It also has an exposure lock on it, and so I can get an exposure if I know that my shot needs to be exposed slightly different. I can expose a different part of the scene, hold down the exposure lock, and it will not change when I go back to the other part of the scene. So that's one way of handling that. Okay, so that's an older camera. Let's bump up quite a few years into the digital age here, and I'm going to show you this Canon that I've got. And this Canon specifically is kind of outdated at this point. I use this for illustrating examples here. But more or less, you can see that metering has come a little ways since the old Aperture Priority only. Obviously, if you have aperture priority, it would make sense that some people, in certain shooting situations, you would want to have shutter priority, okay, where you're actually picking the shutter speed and it's doing the math to figure out the aperture that's related. Now, I will say that the metering systems on these modern cameras have come a long way since just simple center weighted metering, which is what Canon and Nikon and Pentax and all the big companies used to do back in the day. But anyway, this has various set of modes here, and this is pretty standard across all Canon cameras. You have, you know, these little icons, little pictures of like the chick and the mountain and the flower and all, if you want a specific situation, and it'll kind of do a lot of the math for you. All you have to do is push the button and go. But if you go into these semi-automatic modes, okay, A depth is aperture priority with a depth of field. In the way it focuses, it's going to bring focus into the equation on that to come up with your aperture. Because remember, aperture also affects what all is in focus in your shot. I'm not going to talk about that so much right now. M is manual, okay, and this is if you are using a handheld meter and you want to do your own settings. I think when you look through here, pretty much you jog the shutter wheel and it will adjust the aperture. Then I hold down this button on the back, and then it will affect the shutter speed. Again, consult your own camera manual on how to do this on your particular model. The next one down, I have AV, TV, and P, and I'm going to briefly explain these. AV is aperture priority, okay, or aperture value. And basically, when I half hold down the shutter release and I twist the shutter jog here, basically what it's going to do is I'm going to see the apertures changing. Okay, so I'm going to see it go from, this is a 1.8 lens, so I'll probably go from 1.8 up to 2.8 and so on and so forth, 2.0, etc. This camera is tuned in thirds of a stop, and unfortunately, this is very anal retentive to people who want the perfect exposure on a digital camera, but it's more difficult for beginner students because you're seeing just numbers that really you don't see a logic that relate to, whereas the older cameras that increase in one-stop increments seem to make more sense. But these actually increase in thirds of a stop, so every 3 clicks it's going to be 1 stop. Okay, so that's how you would use AV, and then what it does is it figures out the aperture value. Based on your aperture value, it figures out the correct shutter speed. It will preview that for you so you can see if it's too slow to handheld or if you need more light or less light. TV stands for time value, and this is shutter priority. Okay, so when I flip the jog wheel now, what it's going to do is it's going to change the shutter speeds in increments of, actually, again, third of a stop on more modern cameras. And I'm able to figure out, okay, I can't handhold it at 130 because I've had way too much coffee today, so I need to at least be getting 1/60th. And if it cannot widen the aperture enough, it'll start blinking and tell you that it's going to be not exposed correctly. But that's basically what that does. Now, P is program shift, okay? And what this does, this is probably the most simple, I should have started here, but this is the most simple of all modes. When I'm in P mode, what I do is I simply hold the shutter halfway down, compose my subject, and it's going to come up with its best guess at the mix between shutter speed and aperture that is going to be usable for your photograph. And remember, both those are going to equate into your exposure value, which is going to be the correct exposure to give the sensor or film. So if I feel like the aperture is too wide, something like that, I can adjust the jog wheel, and it will also, at the same time, it will lower the aperture, raise the aperture, and then, you know, raise or lower the shutter speed to coincide with it to make sure your shutter is correct. So this is the program. I probably use it the least. Aperture I probably use the most. Time occasionally. Time value comes in, or shutter value priority comes in when you're shooting. Like if you want blur in your shot, if you're shooting, you know, I don't know, an event where you want motion in place, like a crowd of people, and you want a slight blur and you want a moving feel to it. Well, I know that at 1/25th of a second, that's not going to be slow enough to capture any motion. I probably need to go down to 30th or 15th and use a tripod, something like that. So anyway, so that's basically how you're going to use these modes in your camera to determine what your correct combination between shutter speed and aperture are. So anyway, this has been The Art of Photography. Thanks for watching. Hope that helped.